You are about to hear a story that the world tried to bury. A story so grotesque and unsettling that those who recorded it dared only hint at its surface, whispering it in corridors, in half-forgotten journals, and then hiding it behind polite histories. Picture a plantation in 1860, the air thick with smoke and decay, where one decaying bedroom becomes a theater of obsession. A woman lies beside her dead husband who no longer breathes, whose pulse no longer counts time, and she refuses to let him go. The world called it grief, but this was not grief. This was control, devotion twisted into ritual, a loophole in mortality itself, bending death into obedience, turning living and dead alike into instruments of power. The household trembled under her will, her slaves drawn into nightly ceremonies where warmth, proximity, and fear were leveraged as tools of domination, each movement meticulously orchestrated. Men often mistake physical dominance for absolute power, assuming a woman's body is a vessel, her mind pliable, her morality predictable, but she was none of these things. She had studied human behavior, manipulation, and obedience, anticipating every reaction, every impulse, every hidden desire, commanding the dead and the living with a precision that erased resistance. Her husband's corpse became more than a body. It became a symbol, a lever, a silent agent through which she asserted authority over friends, family, and slaves alike, the room itself bending to her intentions as each slave performed her ritual of obedience. Every night, every whispered instruction, every carefully timed gesture reinforced her supremacy. She had discovered a way to bend mortality and human psychology to her will, a system invisible to all but herself, a kingdom in which life and death obeyed her rules, loyalty was coerced through horror, and power was absolute. This was not a story of grief or madness. This was a story of someone who had learned the ultimate secret. Control is never taken. It is designed, enforced, and made inevitable. And tonight, you are about to witness it. By the second night, the room had become a world of its own, a chamber where time and morality bent to her will, the corpse lying pale and stiff at the center of a ritual that was neither mourning nor madness, but something far more terrifying, mastery. The slaves moved with trembling hands, warming his cold body as she commanded, every gesture a lesson in obedience, every breath a subtle reinforcement of her absolute authority. And they knew there was no escape from her gaze, no defiance that could go unpunished, no thought she could not measure. Her husband, though dead, had become a tool, a symbol through which he manipulated everyone in the household, and each night, the rituals grew more intricate, more precise, a choreography of power designed to imprint fear and compliance into the very bones of those who served her. The air was thick with incense, sweat, and the subtle tension of suppressed terror. And yet, in that oppressive atmosphere, she moved with a calmness that made the impossible seem inevitable, a quiet predator orchestrating the minds of the living while the corpse at her side radiated her dominion. They whispered among themselves, some praying, some cursing silently, but all participating in a system they did not understand, a system she had built meticulously over years, learning human weakness, exploiting loyalty, and transforming fear into devotion. She was not merely a widow, she was a strategist, a psychologist, a ruler of perception, bending reality so subtly that the boundaries between life and death, obedience and terror, devotion and manipulation became indistinguishable. Every motion she made was a signal, every silence a command, and with each passing night, the house itself seemed to tighten, to lean toward her authority, compressing the space around the bed, around the corpse, around the minds of those who dared enter her kingdom. This was no grief, no fleeting obsession, no tale of madness whispered for scandal. It was power in its purest, most horrifying form, and by the end of each night, every living soul in that room knew that they were no longer participants in a household. They were instruments in her design, instruments that could not resist, could not escape, and could not survive untransformed. As the night stretched on, the boundaries between life and death began to blur in ways that terrified and fascinated the household simultaneously, for the corpse of her husband was no longer inert. It had become a constant axis around which her authority revolved, a silent witness to her commands, a symbol of inevitability that reinforced her absolute control over those who once assumed themselves masters of their own fate. The slaves, drawn into her nightly ceremonies, moved with a mechanical precision born of fear and repetition, their bodies warm, trembling, obedient, each gesture carefully observed and corrected, each glance monitored, until the line between voluntary devotion and coerced compliance dissolved entirely. She did not need to raise her voice. Her presence alone imposed law, her calmness enforcing obedience more effectively than any whip or threat, and every inch of the room, every shadow in the corners, every flicker of candlelight seemed to bend toward her will, acknowledging her dominion. Her husband's corpse lay at the center of this ritualized world, and though he had no consciousness, his stillness amplified the horror, the obedience, the absolute hierarchy she had engineered, teaching the living the terrifying lesson that power need not be living to command, that mastery could be enacted silently, invisibly, and irrevocably. No man, no servant, no observer could remain untouched by the psychic architecture she had built. Each movement of her hand, each instruction whispered under her breath, each adjustment of blankets or warmth became a demonstration of authority so subtle and total that resistance became inconceivable. The household had ceased to be a simple plantation. It had become a crucible, a laboratory of obedience and psychological manipulation, and she, the widow, the strategist, the orchestrator, moved through it with absolute inevitability, knowing the effect of each action, predicting the collapse of pride, the bending of will, the silent acceptance of her dominion. What outsiders called grief, madness, or superstition was nothing of the sort. It was the deliberate engineering of submission and fear, a command over both the living and the dead that turned every human presence in her domain into an instrument of her power, a nightly affirmation that her authority was beyond question, unchallenged, and utterly complete. By the fourth night, the household had fallen entirely under her gravity, and even the walls of the plantation seemed to bend toward her will, shadows stretching unnaturally as if recognizing the hierarchy she had established. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, no longer a mere body but a fulcrum of fear, ritual, and domination, a silent testament to the absolute authority she wielded over life, death, and perception. Every motion she made, every subtle adjustment of blankets or position, was observed, catalogued, and internalized by the slaves, who moved as extensions of her will, their own identities dissolving into the obedience she demanded. There was a rhythm to these nights, a pattern so meticulous that it bordered on sacred, and anyone who entered the room felt it immediately. The air was thick not just with incense or the warmth of bodies, but with power itself, palpable, heavy, and inescapable. Her husband, though dead, had become a symbol of control so profound that it rendered any challenge meaningless. The living understood instinctively that the game they thought they played was no longer theirs to influence. Even the strongest, most defiant servants had learned that subtle gestures, whispered instructions, and silent observation could unmake them more effectively than any overt punishment. Fear had become internalized, obedience habitual, and the boundaries between voluntary action and coerced compliance indistinguishable. She did not need to command with anger or cruelty. The ritual itself, the choreography of warmth, shadow, and attention, was enough to enforce her dominance night after night. And while the world outside carried on under the illusion of law, morality, and order, within that bedroom, she had constructed a microcosm of power entirely her own, where obedience was absolute, fear was constant, and her influence stretched invisibly through every living soul present. This was no grief, no eccentricity, no superstition. It was deliberate, precise, and terrifying mastery, the kind that reshapes the minds of all who encounter it, leaving no one untouched, unaltered, or unafraid. By the fifth night, the psychological architecture of her control had become so complete that the slaves moved without hesitation, without thought, and without question, their bodies warmed to the corpse not out of pity or grief, but out of learned instinct, a habitual acknowledgement of her absolute authority. The room itself seemed to pulse with tension and expectation, every flicker of candlelight casting shadows that stretched and leaned toward her, as though the very air recognized the hierarchy she had established. Her husband's corpse, motionless and pale, had become more than a symbol. It was a tool of dominance, a silent agent through which she orchestrated obedience and loyalty, a constant reminder that even death could be wielded as power when intelligence and will were applied without hesitation. She did not speak often. She did not need to. The ritual itself communicated everything. Each placement of a hand, each adjustment of a blanket, each calculated pause was a command, and each command was internalized, obeyed, and amplified by those present. Any misstep, any hesitation, any sign of personal assertion was quietly corrected, and the correction itself became part of the ritual, teaching the living that resistance was futile and that mastery could be exercised without anger, without cruelty, and without overt force. Even her husband, dead in innate, exerted influence. The household had come to understand instinctively that his continued presence at her side was a reminder of the power she held over perception, over reality, and over the behavior of every living being in the room. What outsiders would call madness, superstition, or grief was, in reality, a deliberate system of control, psychological engineering designed to bend will, manipulate fear, and ensure unquestioned obedience. By the end of each night, the slaves, her husband's relatives, and anyone who dared enter the room were no longer merely participants. They were instruments in a machine of influence that she had constructed, a machine that ensured that life itself conformed to the parameters she dictated, and that her authority was never in doubt. By the sixth night, the full weight of her influence had settled into the household like a thick, suffocating fog, and every living soul present had begun to internalize the rules she had imposed. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, cold, yet transformed into an instrument of obedience that no man, woman, or child could defy. The slaves moved with a precision that bordered on mechanical, hands warming the inert body as though it were a sacred ritual, each motion a lesson in submission and recognition of her absolute authority. Even subtle hesitations or glances that betrayed thoughtfulness were corrected silently, seamlessly, ensuring that the boundaries between voluntary action and coerced compliance became invisible, imperceptible, and permanent. The room itself seemed to bend toward her, the shadows leaning, the candlelight flickering in unnatural ways, the very air charged with an invisible power that communicated dominance more effectively than words ever could. Her husband's body, inert yet present, reinforced her control, making the living realize instinctively that they were no longer actors but instruments, participants in a system they could not escape or understand. She spoke sparingly, only when necessary, allowing ritual, observation, and the meticulous choreography of obedience to enforce the hierarchy she demanded. Every night was an exercise in psychological engineering, a masterclass in manipulating perception, fear, and loyalty, and by the end of each session, every servant understood that disobedience, hesitation, or doubt was not an option. What outsiders would call grief, madness, or superstition was in truth a methodical, deliberate system of power, one that transformed human behavior into a reflection of her will, bending life itself around the shape of her dominance. Even the strongest, most defiant among them had been quietly broken, reconditioned, and incorporated into the ritual, learning that fear, submission, and acknowledgement of authority could be elicited without violence, without threat, without overt cruelty. The household had become her laboratory, the corpse her instrument, and she, the widow, had become a force whose mastery extended far beyond grief, morality, or society's understanding, a force that reshaped every mind it touched. By the seventh night, her mastery had become absolute, the household operating like a living instrument attuned entirely to her will, each person moving in perfect synchrony with a system they could not resist, fully aware yet powerless to act independently. The corpse of her husband, pale and innate, had become a fulcrum of psychological domination, a silent testament to her authority that demanded acknowledgement from every living being in the room. The slaves, conditioned through nights of repetition, moved with precision, hands warming the body, their fear and fascination intertwined, their obedience instinctual, reflexive, and unquestioned. Every gesture she made, every subtle adjustment, every imperceptible shift in posture communicated control, and every person present responded without hesitation because they had learned the most critical lesson of all: defiance is invisible to her, and compliance is inescapable. The room itself seemed to bend toward her power. Shadows deepened, air thickened, and the faintest flicker of candlelight became a signal that her authority extended even to perception itself. Her husband, though dead, was a tool in this system, his body reinforcing the rituals that ensured obedience and submission, reminding everyone that life and death alike could be harnessed to project influence. Even whispers of disobedience or doubt were corrected through silence, subtle gestures, and the relentless pressure of expectation, teaching that mastery does not require aggression, only calculation, observation, and inevitability. What outsiders would label grief, superstition, or insanity was, in truth, an invisible network of control, a carefully constructed system that manipulated perception, loyalty, and fear in equal measure. By this point, any attempt at resistance had dissolved. Every living soul had internalized the hierarchy, recognizing that her authority was total, unyielding, and permanent. The widow, with her dead husband as her instrument, had transformed the bedroom into a crucible of obedience, shaping behavior, bending will, and demonstrating a truth so fundamental yet terrifying. Control does not rely on life, threat, or force. It relies on awareness, precision, and the invisible command of inevitability. By the eighth night, the psychological weight of her presence had become unbearable for anyone who entered the room, and the household had surrendered entirely to her invisible yet absolute authority. The corpse of her husband, pale and motionless, had become more than a symbol. It was the axis around which fear, loyalty, and obedience revolved, an ever-present instrument of control that reinforced her dominion with silent, terrifying precision. The slaves moved with unwavering exactness, hands warming the innate body as if guided by instinct. Each gesture measured, each glance evaluated, and any deviation met with subtle correction, ensuring that their minds, as much as their bodies, were subsumed into the ritual of obedience. Her commands were almost entirely unspoken. The choreography itself communicated instruction, expectation, and judgment, leaving no room for question, hesitation, or resistance. Even her husband, though dead, exerted influence, his lifeless presence magnifying the power she wielded over the living, making them understand that mastery does not depend on vitality but on perception, calculation, and relentless psychological pressure. The air in the room was thick, charged with a tension that blurred the line between life and death, obedience and terror, devotion and manipulation, making it impossible for anyone to act independently without first acknowledging her authority. Each night, the household was reminded of the immutable hierarchy she had created, and the boundaries between voluntary action and coerced compliance dissolved entirely. What the world outside called grief, superstition, or insanity was, in truth, an engineered system of dominance, a methodical application of human psychology designed to instill unshakable fear and absolute loyalty. By now, every living soul in the room had internalized the lesson. Power does not shout. It is silent, calculated, inevitable, and unavoidable. The widow had transformed her bedroom into a crucible of authority, her husband's corpse into a tool of obedience, and every motion, every breath, every shadow into a reinforcement of her dominance. The room itself had become a mirror of control, and those within it understood, with a cold clarity, that no one left untouched by her presence would ever be the same again. By the ninth night, the household had become a living monument to her dominance, a place where faith, ritual, and obedience had fused into a single, unbreakable system of control. The corpse of her husband, still pale and lifeless, had evolved from a symbol into an active instrument, a fulcrum that magnified her authority over every living soul present. The slaves moved with an almost mechanical precision, their hands warming his cold body, their every motion dictated not by thought but by an internalized recognition of her absolute power. No whisper, no hesitation, no subtle act of defiance could escape her attention. Every micro-expression, every heartbeat, every instinctive twitch was catalogued and rendered meaningless by the invisible architecture she had constructed. Her husband's lifeless form reinforced the hierarchy, a constant, silent reminder that life itself could be harnessed to assert control, and that mastery did not require strength, threat, or violence. It required foresight, observation, and the subtle engineering of perception. The room seemed to pulse with her will, shadows stretching unnaturally toward her, candlelight bending like it knew the weight of authority, the very air charged with inevitability. Any thought of rebellion, any spark of resistance, was corrected with a gesture so slight that it almost went unnoticed, yet the lesson was indelible. Defiance was impossible, obedience unavoidable. Her mastery had become so complete that grief, superstition, and morality had no place in her system. The household no longer operated according to conventional rules, only according to the rhythm she dictated. Even the strongest or most defiant servants had been quietly reshaped, their behavior molded into instruments of her command, their perception of reality altered to acknowledge her unchallengeable authority. By this point, every living presence understood a truth so fundamental yet terrifying that it could not be ignored. Control is not granted, it is engineered, and when executed with precision, it becomes invisible, total, and absolute. The widow, with her dead husband as both symbol and tool, had created a universe entirely her own, and in that universe, every mind, every body, every motion bent inexorably to her will. By the 10th night, the ritual had become an unbroken cycle of dominance, a choreography of power that extended beyond the bedroom and into the minds of every living being in the household. The corpse of her husband, still cold and motionless, had transcended its physical state to become a silent, omnipresent agent of control, a fulcrum around which obedience and terror rotated. The slaves, their hands warm to his body as instructed, moved with a precision that no longer required thought, their actions automatic, habitual, and inseparable from the psychological framework she had imposed. Even subtle glances, hesitant breaths, and the smallest tremors of will were noticed, interpreted, and corrected before they could manifest as defiance. She did not need to raise her voice, for her presence alone carried the weight of inevitability. Every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, every creak of the floor reinforced the invisible hierarchy she had constructed. Her husband, inert though he was, reinforced her authority, a reminder that life and death alike could serve as instruments of control when wielded by a mind trained in observation, manipulation, and calculated inevitability. By now, any sense of individuality or resistance had been quietly erased. The household had internalized a system of obedience so thoroughly that fear and compliance had become instinct, reflexive, unthinking. What outsiders would call grief, insanity, or superstition was, in truth, a deliberate structure of power, psychological engineering designed to assert dominance without aggression, to bend perception without threat, and to enforce loyalty without overt coercion. Every motion, every pause, every carefully orchestrated act within that room served as reinforcement of her mastery, and every living participant understood, consciously or not, that they were caught in a system they could not challenge, a system they could not escape. By the end of the night, the air itself seemed to pulse with her authority, a subtle but inescapable reminder that the widow had not merely survived grief, she had weaponized it, creating a kingdom of obedience, fear, and invisible control, a kingdom in which her power was absolute, unassailable, and permanent. By the 11th night, the household had become a crucible of invisible power, a place where the living and the dead were woven into a single system of obedience, ritual, and psychological domination. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, innate yet commanding, a constant reminder that life itself could be harnessed to enforce authority when wielded with precision and understanding. The slaves, conditioned through nights of repetition, moved with unwavering focus, their hands warming his body not from sympathy, not from grief, but from ingrained recognition of the hierarchy she had imposed. Every motion, every hesitation, every breath was observed and corrected with subtlety so refined it was almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. Her commands were embedded in ritual, her dominance reinforced by choreography, timing, and the unspoken understanding that resistance was futile. Shadows leaned toward her, candlelight flickered unnaturally, and even the air seemed to acknowledge her presence, thick with tension and inevitability. Her husband, though dead, amplified her control, his body a silent testament to the reach of her will, a tool that magnified faith, loyalty, and psychological submission in ways the living could neither comprehend nor counter. The system she had created left no room for individuality. Compliance was instinctive, obedience habitual, and thought itself was reshaped to align with her authority. Outsiders would call it madness, grief, or superstition, but it was deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly effective, a methodical engineering of perception and behavior that ensured her mastery over everyone in the room. By now, even the most defiant or proud individuals had been quietly broken, their resistance replaced by an almost mechanical acknowledgement of her power. Each night reinforced a truth more profound and more chilling than the last. Control does not require life, coercion, or force. It requires awareness, precision, and inevitability. The widow had transformed the bedroom into a kingdom of obedience, a laboratory of fear, and a stage where mastery, not morality, dictated every motion, every thought, and every allegiance. By the 12th night, her dominance had transcended ritual and become a law that governed thought itself, a silent architecture of obedience that no living person could escape. The corpse of her husband, pale and unyielding, had become more than a symbol. It was an instrument, a fulcrum through which he imposed control, shaping perception, loyalty, and fear with every breath, every subtle gesture, every imperceptible shift in posture. The slaves moved with mechanical precision, hands warming the inert body, their compliance now instinctive, reflexive, and unquestioned, their thoughts bending to the invisible hierarchy she had constructed. Even hesitation, subtle defiance, or fleeting doubt was corrected before it could manifest, absorbed into the system she controlled so thoroughly that resistance had become impossible to conceive. She spoke rarely, not because she lacked need, but because her power was embedded in rhythm, gesture, and the silent gravity she projected, teaching the living that mastery does not require speech, threat, or aggression. Her husband, though dead, reinforced a dominion, a living, or rather, undead, confirmation of her authority, demonstrating that power is not constrained by life, and that death can be transformed into obedience when wielded with understanding and precision. The air of the room itself seemed to bend toward her will, shadows stretching and leaning as though acknowledging the invisible control she exerted, candlelight flickering with an unnatural rhythm that reinforced the hierarchy. By now, every living participant, every servant and relative, had internalized the system she imposed. Compliance had become instinctual, fear habitual, and obedience absolute. What the outside world would call madness, superstition, or grief was, in truth, a calculated system of psychological mastery, a deliberate design that reshaped perception, manipulated loyalty, and enforced authority invisibly yet irrevocably. Each night, the bedroom became a microcosm of control, her husband's corpse the centerpiece of her dominion, and she, the widow, remained the unseen, inescapable force around which every thought, action, and fear revolved, proving a terrifying truth. Mastery does not shout, it is silent, precise, and inevitable. By the 13th night, the household had fully succumbed to the invisible architecture of her control, and the room pulsed with the weight of authority so absolute that resistance no longer existed, not even in thought. The corpse of her husband, pale and rigid, had become a central axis of her dominion, a tool through which she extended her influence over the living, demonstrating with every cold, lifeless presence that life itself was secondary to the structure of obedience she imposed. The slaves, conditioned through repetition, moved as if part of a single organism, hands warming the inert body, gestures precise, eyes lowered, their minds absorbed into the system she had engineered. Even fleeting doubts, subtle defiance, or the smallest twitch of individuality was quietly corrected, absorbed into the rhythm of obedience, and transformed into reinforcement of her authority. Her commands were rarely spoken. Her power was embedded in gesture, timing, and the subtle choreography of dominance that left no room for challenge, no opportunity for rebellion, no illusion of freedom. The air itself seemed to recognize her supremacy. Shadows stretched unnaturally toward her, candlelight danced with intent, and the tension in the room was so thick it could be felt pressing against the chest of anyone who entered. Her husband, though dead, reinforced the lesson. Even in death, he served as an instrument of control, a silent amplifier of faith, loyalty, and recognition of hierarchy. By this point, every living participant had internalized her system. Compliance was automatic, obedience instinctual, and the awareness of her power omnipresent. What the outside world might dismiss as grief, madness, or superstition was, in reality, an expert orchestration of perception and influence, a deliberate reshaping of human behavior that rendered her authority invisible yet undeniable. The widow had created a kingdom within a room, her mastery so complete that even the strongest wills bent unconsciously to her will, proving a terrifying truth. Power does not require life, threat, or violence. It requires calculation, inevitability, and the quiet, relentless assertion of dominance. By the 14th night, the full magnitude of her control had settled like a shadow over the household, an invisible gravity that dictated not only actions but thought itself. The corpse of her husband, still pale and motionless, had become an instrument of psychological domination, its presence amplifying her authority in ways that no living being could counter. The slaves moved with an unthinking precision, hands warming the inert body, each gesture a reinforcement of hierarchy, each motion an acknowledgement of her inevitability. Hesitation, defiance, or even fleeting thought of rebellion was absorbed and nullified by the system she had meticulously engineered, a system so precise that obedience had become instinctive and fear had become reflex. Her commands were embedded in ritual, subtle gestures, and pauses that carried meaning more profound than any shouted word could convey. The room itself seemed to lean into her presence, shadows stretching unnaturally, candlelight flickering with the rhythm of her will, the air thick with unspoken pressure. Her husband, though dead, functioned as a fulcrum, a symbol of authority that reinforced compliance, loyalty, and terror simultaneously, a reminder that mastery is not bound by life, that power can extend beyond death when executed with calculation and precision. Even the most defiant or proud servants had been quietly reshaped, their perception of reality altered to acknowledge her supremacy, their autonomy absorbed into the invisible structure of control she maintained. Outsiders would call it grief, madness, or superstition, but this was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly effective. It was psychological engineering at its most ruthless, bending perception, obedience, and fear into instruments of domination. By this point, the bedroom had become a kingdom, the corpse a tool, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery left every living being forever changed. Each night reinforced the same immutable truth. Control does not rely on threat or aggression, it relies on inevitability, observation, and the quiet, relentless shaping of reality. By the 15th night, the household had been transformed into a living monument to her dominance, a place where every action, every breath, every flicker of thought was absorbed into the system of control she had meticulously constructed. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale and still, yet charged with an authority that extended far beyond death, a fulcrum through which she orchestrated obedience, loyalty, and fear with precise, invisible force. The slaves moved without hesitation, their hands warming his inert body with an almost mechanical devotion, each gesture a reflection of the hierarchy they had internalized. There was no resistance left, no defiance, not even in thought. Any trace of autonomy was quietly erased, absorbed into the rhythm of ritual and expectation she had enforced night after night. Her presence alone carried the weight of inevitability. Every subtle shift of posture, every pause in her movement, every glance, reinforcing her mastery over mind and body alike. Shadows leaned toward her, candlelight flickered with unnatural cadence, and the very air seemed thick with silent pressure, reinforcing the invisible authority she wielded. Her husband, though lifeless, amplified the psychological effect, a reminder that power does not require life, aggression, or coercion, only vision, calculation, and control over perception. By this point, even the strongest, most resistant servants had been reshaped, their understanding of reality altered to conform to her system, their compliance instinctive, and their fear habitual. What the world outside might call grief, superstition, or madness was in truth a masterclass in manipulation, an engineered structure of obedience that left no room for question or escape. The widow had turned her bedroom into a crucible of authority, a theater of inevitability, and in doing so, had proven a chilling, immutable truth. True mastery is invisible, total, and permanent, and those who come into contact with it are forever changed, bound to the silent gravity of its design. By the 16th night, the full extent of her mastery had become undeniable. The household fully surrendered to the invisible framework of her control. The corpse of her husband, pale, cold, and inert, had evolved into a symbol and instrument of authority so potent that even the living could not resist its influence. The slaves moved with a mechanical precision born of habit and fear, their hands warming his body as though compelled by some force beyond their comprehension, each gesture reinforcing the hierarchy she had constructed. Any hesitation, any flicker of defiance, any spark of independent thought was absorbed and nullified before it could surface, leaving obedience instinctive and reflexive. She spoke rarely. Her power existed in gesture, timing, and ritual, communicated through subtle shifts in posture, pauses, and the cadence of motion. The room itself seemed to pulse with her will, shadows stretching unnaturally toward her, candlelight flickering with a rhythm dictated by her presence, air thick with the silent weight of inevitability. Her husband, though dead, amplified her influence, demonstrating that mastery is not confined to the living, that even death can be wielded as a tool of control when intelligence, calculation, and observation are applied with precision. Even the most defiant among the servants had been quietly reshaped, their minds and perceptions aligned with her authority, their autonomy dissolved into the invisible architecture she had built. Outsiders would dismiss it as madness, grief, or superstition, but this was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly effective, a system designed to manipulate fear, loyalty, and perception to maintain and question dominance. Each night, the bedroom became a crucible of power, her husband's corpse the centerpiece of obedience, and she, the widow, its orchestrator, proving a chilling truth. Control is invisible, inevitable, and absolute, and those who encounter it are forever transformed, their understanding of life, death, and hierarchy irreversibly altered. By the 17th night, the household had been entirely subsumed by the force of her presence, a quiet, relentless authority that bent thought, will, and action to her design. The corpse of her husband, pale and unyielding, had become both symbol and instrument, its stillness amplifying her dominance over every living soul present. The slaves moved with an automatic precision, hands warming the innate body, gestures flawless, obedience internalized to the point of instinct. Every hesitation, every flicker of defiance, every thought that might have strayed into independence was absorbed, corrected, and reproposed within the system she had meticulously engineered, leaving no trace of autonomy. She did not need to speak. The ritual itself, the subtle shifts of her body, the timing of movements, the weight of her gaze conveyed instruction, judgment, and command more effectively than words ever could. Shadows seemed to stretch and lean toward her. Candlelight flickered with unnatural rhythm, and the very air pressed against the participants, reinforcing the hierarchy with a palpable weight. Her husband, though dead, reinforced her authority, a silent amplifier of compliance and recognition that even death could be harnessed to enforce dominance when applied with precision. By now, any sense of individuality, pride, or defiance had been quietly erased. Every participant acted as a cog in a system designed to maintain her absolute control. What the outside world might dismiss as grief, madness, or superstition was, in truth, a calculated, expert orchestration of perception and obedience, a microcosm of authority that reshaped reality for all who entered it. By the end of each night, the bedroom was no longer a room, it was a kingdom, the corpse a tool, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery over life, death, and mind was total, irreversible, and terrifying. Those who bore witness were forever changed, their understanding of control, fear, and submission rewritten by a silent, inescapable power that could not be resisted. By the 18th night, the household had been completely absorbed into her invisible system of dominance, each living soul a willing or unwilling instrument in her design. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, still, pale, yet charged with a presence that magnified her authority, demonstrating that power is not bound to life but can extend through ritual, perception, and psychological precision. The slaves moved with a mechanized devotion, hands warming the inert body as though compelled by instinct, each gesture reinforcing the hierarchy she had meticulously constructed. Any hesitation, fleeting doubt, or spark of defiance was instantly corrected, integrated into the ritual, and transformed into another layer of obedience. She spoke rarely. Her power existed in the choreography of ritual, in the cadence of motion, the subtle shifts of posture, and the silent command of her gaze. The air itself seemed to bend toward her will, shadows deepening unnaturally, candlelight flickering in sync with the invisible rhythm of authority she projected, reinforcing the inevitability of her control. Her husband, though dead, amplified her influence, a silent reminder that mastery does not require life or overt threat. It requires observation, precision, and unassailable inevitability. Even the most resistant servants had been quietly reshaped, their thoughts, perceptions, and behaviors molded to align with her authority, their autonomy absorbed into the invisible architecture she maintained. What outsiders might call grief, madness, or superstition was, in fact, deliberate and calculated mastery, a psychological system that bent perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of obedience. The bedroom had become a crucible of power, her husband's corpse the centerpiece, and she, the widow, its orchestrator, demonstrating a chilling, immutable truth. Control is silent, total, and permanent, and all who encounter it are forever transformed, bound to the gravity of her design, unable to escape the inevitability she has imposed. By the 19th night, the boundaries between life and death, obedience and fear, devotion and manipulation had all but dissolved, leaving the household fully enmeshed in her system of invisible control. The corpse of her husband, still pale and motionless, had become more than a body. It was an instrument, a fulcrum around which she exerted authority, demonstrating that power transcends mortality when applied with precision and awareness. The slaves moved with flawless, almost mechanical devotion, hands warming the innate body, gestures synchronized to the rhythm of ritual, each action reinforcing the hierarchy she had created. Any hint of hesitation, rebellion, or independent thought was quietly absorbed, corrected, and folded into the system she maintained, ensuring that obedience was instinctual, reflexive, and absolute. Her commands were embedded in movement, timing, and gaze, communicated through ritual rather than speech, leaving the participants aware yet powerless to resist. Shadows stretched unnaturally toward her, candlelight danced in a rhythm dictated by her presence, and the air itself seemed weighted with inevitability. Her husband, though dead, amplified the psychological impact, his stillness a constant reminder that mastery requires neither life nor overt aggression, only calculation, observation, and unyielding inevitability. By now, even the strongest, most defiant servants had been reshaped, their perception of reality adjusted to acknowledge her authority, their thoughts and actions absorbed into the invisible architecture of dominance she had constructed. Outsiders might dismiss it as grief, superstition, or madness, but it was a deliberate, methodical system, designed to manipulate perception, loyalty, and fear with terrifying effectiveness. The bedroom had become a kingdom, her husband's corpse a tool, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery reshaped every mind it touched. By this point, the household understood a chilling, immutable truth. Control is silent, total, and irreversible, and those who submit, or are forced to submit, are forever altered, their understanding of life, death, and authority rewritten by the gravity of her will. By the 20th night, the household no longer operated as a group of independent individuals. It had become a single organism, each member synchronized to the invisible rhythm of her dominance. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, still, pale, yet charged with a presence that amplified her authority, turning death itself into a tool of psychological control. The slaves moved with near-perfect mechanical precision, their hands warming the innate body, their gestures reinforcing the hierarchy she had constructed with surgical accuracy. Any spark of doubt, hesitation, or defiance was quietly absorbed, corrected, and reproposed into obedience, leaving no room for individuality or resistance. She rarely spoke. Her power was embedded in ritual, in posture, in timing, and in the subtle cadence of her movements, all of which communicated command more effectively than words. Shadows stretched unnaturally toward her, candlelight flickered with an unnatural rhythm, and the air itself seemed thick with inevitability, compressing around every living participant and enforcing the unspoken laws of her control. Her husband, though dead, served as a constant amplifier of dominance, reminding all that mastery does not require life or force, only awareness, precision, and unyielding calculation. Even the most defiant individuals had been reshaped, their minds and perceptions absorbed into the invisible architecture of control she had created, their autonomy erased, their fear and obedience instinctive. What the outside world might call grief, madness, or superstition was, in truth, a deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly effective system of power, bending perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of dominance. The bedroom had become a crucible of absolute authority, her husband's corpse a central tool, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery left all who encountered it forever transformed, bound to the silent gravity of her will, unable to resist, unable to escape, and unable to return to the life they once knew. By the 21st night, the household had been transformed into a living testament to invisible authority, a place where fear, ritual, and obedience had fused into a single, unbreakable system. The corpse of her husband, pale and unmoving, had become both symbol and instrument, a constant fulcrum around which she extended her dominance, demonstrating that power does not depend on life, threat, or violence, but on calculation, observation, and inevitability. The slaves moved with instinctive precision, hands warming his inert body, gestures flawless, their obedience automatic and unquestioned, a reflection of the psychological architecture she had constructed. Any trace of hesitation, defiance, or individual thought was absorbed, corrected, and integrated into the system, ensuring that submission had become reflexive, fear habitual, and compliance total. Her commands existed not in words but in gesture, timing, ritual, and the subtle weight of her presence. The room itself seemed to lean toward her, shadows deepening unnaturally, candlelight flickering with a rhythm dictated by her invisible control. Even her husband, though dead, served as a silent amplifier of authority, a reminder that mastery extends beyond mortality, that even a lifeless body can reinforce obedience when wielded with intelligence and precision. By this point, even the strongest and most defiant participants had been quietly reshaped, their perceptions, thoughts, and actions absorbed into her system of control. What the world outside might dismiss as grief, madness, or superstition was, in fact, an expertly engineered structure of psychological domination, bending loyalty, perception, and fear into instruments of obedience. The bedroom had become a kingdom, the corpse a tool, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery was total, irreversible, and inescapable, a quiet gravity that reshaped everyone who entered into a permanent acknowledgement of her authority. Each night reinforced a chilling truth. Control is invisible, inevitable, and total, and those who experience it are forever changed, their understanding of life, death, and hierarchy rewritten by the inescapable weight of her will. By the 22nd night, the household had become a living instrument of her design, each participant a component in a system of obedience so refined that independent thought was no longer possible. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, cold and unmoving, yet it radiated an authority amplified by a presence, a symbol and tool of control that left no room for doubt or defiance. The slaves moved with mechanical precision, hands warming the inert body, their motions habitual, instinctive, and in complete alignment with the hierarchy she had meticulously constructed. Any hesitation, fleeting defiance, or spark of individuality was absorbed and corrected before it could surface, leaving obedience automatic and fear internalized. She rarely spake. Her power existed in the choreography of ritual, in the cadence of her gestures, in the timing of her movements, and in the silent weight of her gaze, all of which communicated control far more effectively than words. Shadows deepened unnaturally, candlelight flickered with a rhythm dictated by her presence, and the air itself seemed thick with inevitability, compressing the room around her authority. Even her husband, though dead, reinforced the system, demonstrating that mastery transcends mortality and that power can extend through ritual, observation, and psychological precision. By now, even the most defiant servants had been reshaped, their perceptions, thoughts, and actions absorbed into the architecture of her control, their fear and obedience instinctive, their autonomy erased. What outsiders might dismiss as grief, superstition, or madness was in truth a deliberate, methodical system of dominance, bending perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of submission. The bedroom had become a crucible of power, her husband's corpse a central tool, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery reshaped everyone who encountered it, proving a terrifying truth. Control is silent, total, and inevitable, and those who fall under its gravity are forever changed, unable to resist, unable to escape, and forever bound to her will. By the 23rd night, the household had become an extension of her mind, a living network entirely aligned with the invisible system of control she had meticulously constructed. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, cold, yet charged with an authority that amplified her presence, a silent testament to the power she wielded over life, death, and perception. The slaves moved with instinctive precision, their hands warming the inert body as if compelled by a force beyond comprehension, their actions automatic, habitual, and synchronized with the hierarchy she had enforced night after night. Any flicker of hesitation, any trace of defiance, any hint of autonomous thought was quietly absorbed, corrected, and transformed into reinforcement of her authority, leaving obedience internalized and reflexive. She rarely spoke. Her mastery existed in gesture, timing, ritual, and the subtle weight of her presence, all of which communicated command more effectively than any words could. Shadows seemed to bend toward her, candlelight flickered in an unnatural rhythm, and the very air in the room carried a pressure that reminded every living participant of the inevitability of her dominance. Her husband, though dead, reinforced her authority, demonstrating that mastery does not require life, threat, or violence. It requires calculation, observation, and unyielding precision. Even the strongest, most defiant servants had been reshaped, their perceptions and behaviors absorbed into the invisible architecture of control, their fear and obedience instinctive. Outsiders might dismiss it as grief, madness, or superstition, but it was a deliberate, methodical system, bending perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of obedience. The bedroom had become a kingdom, her husband's corpse the centerpiece of power, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery left every soul forever transformed, bound to the silent gravity of a design, incapable of resistance, escape, or return to the life they once knew. By the 24th night, the household had been entirely subsumed by an invisible architecture of power, a system that dictated not only actions but thought, perception, and even instinct. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, lifeless, yet transformed into an instrument of control that magnified her authority over every living being present. The slaves moved with flawless, mechanical precision, their hands warming the inert body as if guided by some force beyond comprehension, each gesture reinforcing the hierarchy she had meticulously imposed. Any spark of hesitation, defiance, or independent thought was instantly absorbed, corrected, and reproposed into obedience, leaving compliance instinctual, fear habitual, and submission absolute. Her mastery was embedded in ritual, posture, timing, and the subtle cadence of her movements, communicated through presence rather than words, making speech almost unnecessary. Shadows deepened unnaturally, candlelight flickered with a rhythm dictated by her, and the air itself seemed thick with inevitability, pressing on every participant in the room. Her husband, though dead, amplified the psychological effect, a constant reminder that mastery can extend beyond mortality, that even death can serve as a tool of authority when applied with calculation and precision. Even the strongest, most resistant servants had been quietly reshaped, their minds and perceptions realigned to accept her control, their autonomy erased, their obedience instinctive. What outsiders might label grief, madness, or superstition was in reality a deliberate, methodical system, designed to manipulate perception, loyalty, and fear with terrifying efficiency. The bedroom had become a crucible of power, her husband's corpse the centerpiece, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery reshaped all who entered, proving a chilling truth. Control is silent, inevitable, and absolute, and those who fall under its gravity are forever changed, bound to the inescapable weight of her will. By the 25th night, the household had ceased to exist as a collection of independent wills and had become a single organism, moving and breathing under the invisible gravity of her control. The corpse of her husband, pale and motionless, lay at the center, yet it radiated an authority that magnified her dominance, proving that power is not bound by life, aggression, or threat, but by precision, awareness, and inevitability. The slaves moved with mechanical devotion, hands warming the inert body, gestures flawless, obedience internalized to the point of instinct, their thoughts bending unconsciously to the architecture she had imposed. Any trace of defiance, hesitation, or autonomous thought was absorbed, corrected, and transformed into another reinforcement of her authority, leaving compliance habitual and fear permanent. She rarely spoke. Her mastery was embedded in ritual, posture, timing, and the subtle weight of her presence, all of which communicated command more effectively than words could. Shadows deepened unnaturally, candlelight flickered in rhythm with her movements, and the very air seemed weighted with inevitability, pressing on every participant and shaping perception without a single word uttered. Her husband, though dead, amplified her authority, a constant reminder that mastery transcends life, that even death can be wielded to enforce obedience when paired with calculation and observation. Even the most defiant servants had been reshaped, their minds realigned, their autonomy erased, their fear and submission instinctive. What the world outside might dismiss as grief, madness, or superstition was, in fact, a calculated, methodical system, bending loyalty, perception, and fear into instruments of obedience. The bedroom had become a crucible of absolute power, her husband's corpse the centerpiece of her dominion, and she, the widow, a force whose silent mastery reshaped all who entered, proving the terrifying truth. Control is invisible, total, and permanent, and those who submit, or are forced to submit, are forever transformed, unable to resist, escape, or return to the life they once knew. By the 26th night, the household had been transformed into a living monument to her dominance, a microcosm where fear, obedience, and ritual had fused into a single, inescapable system. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, still, yet charged with authority that extended her influence beyond the living, proving that power does not require life to be absolute. The slaves moved with precision so automatic it bordered on mechanical, hands warming the innate body, gestures exact, obedience internalized to the point of instinct, every movement a reflection of the invisible hierarchy she had constructed. Any hesitation, fleeting doubt, or spark of autonomous thought was absorbed, corrected, and reproposed into reinforcement of her authority, leaving compliance reflexive, fear habitual, and submission total. She rarely needed to speak. Her mastery existed in ritual, posture, timing, and the subtle weight of her presence, all of which communicated command more effectively than any words. Shadows leaned unnaturally toward her, candlelight flickered in rhythm with her movements, and the air itself carried the oppressive weight of inevitability, pressing against every living participant in the room. Her husband, though dead, amplified the psychological impact, serving as a silent instrument of control, proving that mastery transcends mortality and that even death can enforce obedience when applied with calculation and precision. Even the most defiant servants had been quietly reshaped, their perception of reality altered, their autonomy dissolved, their fear and submission instinctive. Outsiders might dismiss it as grief, madness, or superstition, but it was a deliberate, methodical system designed to bend perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of obedience. The bedroom had become a crucible of power, her husband's corpse a central tool, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery left every soul forever transformed, bound to the inescapable gravity of her will. By the 27th night, the household had fully internalized a system of control, moving and breathing as if a single entity, each living soul perfectly aligned with the invisible architecture of her authority. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, cold, and still, yet charged with an influence that magnified her power, proving that mastery transcends life, threat, and violence. It exists in precision, calculation, and the inevitability of compliance. The slaves moved with near-mechanical devotion, hands warming the inert body, gestures flawless, obedience instinctual and unquestioned, their minds absorbed into the rhythm she had imposed over weeks of ritual. Any spark of hesitation, any thought of defiance, or flicker of independence was absorbed, corrected, and transformed into reinforcement of her authority, leaving no trace of resistance. She rarely spake. Her control existed in movement, timing, ritual, and the subtle gravity of her presence, communicating dominance more effectively than words ever could. Shadows stretched unnaturally toward her, candlelight flickered in cadence with emotions, and the air itself carried the weight of inevitability, pressing on all who entered the room. Her husband, though dead, reinforced her authority, a silent amplifier of obedience and submission, proving that even in death, bodies can be used to extend influence and control. Even the most defiant servants had been reshaped, their thoughts and perceptions realigned, their fear and obedience instinctive, their autonomy dissolved. What outsiders might call grief, madness, or superstition was in reality a meticulously engineered system, bending perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of submission. The bedroom had become a kingdom, her husband's corpse the centerpiece, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery was total, irreversible, and inescapable, demonstrating the terrifying truth. Those who fall under the gravity of true control are forever transformed, bound to it, and unable to escape. By the 28th night, the household had become a perfect reflection of her invisible will, a place where life, death, fear, and obedience intertwined into an unbreakable system of control. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, rigid, yet imbued with a symbolic authority that amplified her presence, proving that true mastery is not dependent on life but on the orchestration of perception and inevitability. The slaves moved with flawless precision, hands warming his inert body as if compelled by instinct, every gesture reinforcing the hierarchy she had constructed and internalized over weeks of ritual. Any hesitation, doubt, or spark of defiance was absorbed and neutralized before it could manifest, leaving compliance automatic, fear reflexive, and obedience total. She rarely spoke. Her mastery existed in posture, timing, ritual, and the subtle cadence of her presence, communicating command with a force more profound than words. Shadows seemed to lean toward her. Candlelight flickered in rhythm with her movements, and the air itself carried the weight of inevitability, pressing on every living participant and shaping perception before it could even be acknowledged. Her husband, though dead, acted as a silent amplifier of authority, a testament that power can extend beyond mortality when combined with precision, observation, and psychological insight. Even the strongest, most defiant servants had been quietly reshaped, their autonomy absorbed into the invisible architecture she maintained, their thoughts, actions, and perceptions bending to her will. Outsiders might label it grief, superstition, or madness, but it was a calculated system of dominance, manipulating perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of submission. The bedroom had become a crucible of absolute power, the corpse the centerpiece of obedience, and she, the widow, a force whose mastery transformed everyone who entered, proving an immutable truth. Control is silent, total, and permanent, and those caught in its gravity are forever changed, incapable of resistance or escape, bound to the inevitability of her will. By the 29th night, the household had become an organism entirely shaped by her invisible hand, every movement, thought, and breath bending to the rhythm of her dominance. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, cold, yet charged with authority, an instrument that magnified her presence and ensured that even death reinforced obedience. The slaves moved with a mechanical devotion, hands warming his inert body, their motions instinctive, perfected, and internalized, leaving no room for hesitation or defiance. Any spark of resistance, autonomy, or doubt was absorbed, corrected, and reproposed into the architecture of obedience she had meticulously constructed. She rarely needed to speak. Her power was embedded in ritual, timing, posture, and the subtle cadence of her presence, communicated through silence and movement, stronger than any words could be. Shadows leaned unnaturally toward her. Candlelight flickered in rhythm with emotion, and the air itself seemed thick with inevitability, pressing against every participant and reinforcing the hierarchy she maintained. Her husband, though dead, amplified her authority, a constant reminder that mastery transcends life, and that power can be extended through observation, calculation, and psychological precision. Even the most defiant servants had been reshaped, their minds, perceptions, and behaviors absorbed into the invisible system of control, their fear and submission instinctive, their autonomy dissolved. Outsiders might dismiss it as grief, madness, or superstition, but it was a deliberate, methodical system, bending perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of obedience. The bedroom had become a kingdom, her husband's corpse the centerpiece, and she, the widow, a force whose silent mastery reshaped every soul present, proving a terrifying, immutable truth. True control is invisible, total, and permanent, and those who fall under it are forever transformed, unable to resist, escape, or return to the life they once knew. By the 30th night, the household had been forged into a living monument to her absolute authority, a place where life, death, thought, and obedience had fused into a single, unbreakable system. The corpse of her husband lay at the center, pale, rigid, yet charged with power, a fulcrum that amplified her presence and ensured that even death served the purpose of control. The slaves moved with mechanical devotion, hands warming his inert body, every gesture perfected, internalized, and inseparable from the hierarchy she had imposed. Any trace of defiance, hesitation, or independent thought was absorbed and reshaped into compliance, leaving obedience instinctive, fear reflexive, and submission total. She rarely spoke. Her mastery existed in gesture, timing, ritual, and the silent, inescapable weight of her presence, commanding without words, bending perception without force. Shadows leaned unnaturally toward her. Candlelight flickered in sync with her movements, and the air itself pressed on every participant, thick with inevitability. Her husband, though dead, served as a constant amplifier of authority, proving that mastery transcends life, that power can extend beyond mortality when executed with calculation, observation, and precision. Even the most resistant servants had been quietly reshaped, their autonomy erased, their perception of reality aligned with her design, their fear and obedience instinctive. What outsiders might dismiss as grief, superstition, or madness was in truth a meticulously engineered system of dominance, bending perception, loyalty, and fear into instruments of submission. The bedroom had become a kingdom, her husband's corpse a tool, and she, the widow, a force whose silent mastery transformed every soul in her orbit, leaving them forever altered. The chilling truth revealed by 30 nights of relentless control is undeniable. True power is invisible, total, and irreversible, and those who come under its gravity can never return to the life they once knew. They are bound, irrevocably, to the quiet, inevitable authority of mastery that has claimed them.